So these are pictures of Santana Row in Santa Clara. And I think we can probably all agree on saying, well, that looks like a pretty nice environment to stroll, shop, and sit on a cafe. And as you can see in the upper left, play some games. So another example of a perfectly pleasant looking shopping streets is Bay Street in Emeryville. But when we look at the bigger picture as suggested by the title of this presentation, then we see that this is Santana Row seen in an aerial, that it is embedded in an entirely auto-oriented environment, and the only safe way of really getting to this space where it's so nice to walk is by actually driving there. And it's similar with Bay Street, which you can see is surrounded by freeways and larger arterials and an adjacent railroad track, and it's very difficult to get to if you decided to walk there or bicycle there. So how did we get to this type of environment where we have to get into our cars in order to drive somewhere where we can walk? So for decades, urban streets have really been optimized for the flow of automobiles. It really started after World War II. And more often than not, this really has occurred to the detriment of the pedestrian, bicycle, and transit access environments, and really to the detriment of the overall livability along many of our urban streets. And this slide shows two areas. To the left, you have an urban area that's been planned and built up during the pre-World War II period. This is Rockridge in Oakland. And just imagine, instead of the BART station that's right in the middle of the image, you have streetcars that actually ran in the area. And it's a very walkable environment. And on the right-hand side, for comparison, is a street, you can see a street network that was really laid out and based on the total acceptance of the car as the only way of moving around in this environment. This is Danville it's Bishop Ranch in, yes, thank you. And so what are the typical patterns that we see here? So the pre-World War II pattern is based on a mixed-use neighborhood, a mixed-use district where you shop and also work, and multiple modes of transportation to get to places that include walking and at the time using transit, and today again includes transit. And on the right-hand side you see what the Bishop Ranch pattern is based on, and it's residential subdivisions, shopping centers, and business parks, and the general separation of uses, and all based, as I said, on one mode of transportation. So what really happened to the transportation network here is that when we started out in the 1900s, we were basically, as you could see in the pre-World War II image. Things were based on a grid pattern, and then right after World War II, there's sort of a break in the pattern that occurred. And we had fewer and fewer streets, and post-1950s, developers who actually don't want to spend a lot of money on building streets reduced the number of streets more and more and more. And this resulted in the patterns that you see to the right of the red line. And we ended up with a very disconnected development pattern. So the basic problem really of these poorly connected networks is the system is dependent on arterials that are autocentric. And there are poor connections, you see this in the image to the right, that all individual pieces of development are actually disconnected, and everybody has to travel out to the arterial, which is that sinuous line at the border between the gray and the green. And that means that all trips include the arterial, and through traffic begins to mix with local traffic, and that exacerbates a pattern of congestion at certain times of day. And this problem continues basically as you have these larger arterials run through your community. Cars travel with greater speeds, and the speed differential between the motor vehicles and the pedestrians and bicyclists creates a less pleasant environment and higher chance of collision between pedestrians and bicyclists, and a higher level of injury that occurs when you have this higher differential of speeds. And also, and this is really an important point, the arterial can really no longer be a seam between parts of the community on one side and the other, and instead, because of the higher speeds and the width, they become dividers. And people actually don't really like to be there, and so we see less and less people actually spending time on those kinds of streets. And another problem is, and I think we all have experienced this, that because the car allows us to travel farther, we've kind of gotten used to accepting that something that is 20 miles away, we consider that that's relatively close, so we get into our cars and travel there. And because that is supported by the kinds of streets that we've built, we've gotten into a dispersal of development patterns and land uses at local, sub-regional, and regional levels. And so we're traveling all over the Bay Area to enjoy certain things, and but in our own communities we spend less time and do not take advantage of walking and bicycling. And this is how we get to driving to places where we then like to walk. And also the spread out land uses, as I said, discourage walking, transit, and bike use. However, there's a growing recognition that streets contribute in many ways to our economic, environmental, and social life. And this is why the city of San Mateo has set out to do the sustainable streets plan. And I just threw this in for fun. Couldn't keep myself from doing that. I think public streets are really our community's true social networks. And many of us have recognized that. And we put our phones aside and try to enjoy those environments that are well designed for humans and their interactions. So today's challenge then is to make the most of our existing street network. And obviously in San Mateo, you're lucky you don't have some of these patterns that I just talked about, because you actually have a pretty strong street grid pattern, and but you're also built up. And so the streets that you already have, that's what you have to work with. And so they are only yay wide, and so if you divide them up between different modes, then the exercise becomes to make the best out of the existing streets that you have. And so in order to do that most effectively, we suggest that the complete streets implementation be network-based versus facility-based, and I'll get back to that point in a second. And to also balance land use and transportation. Just to address the point of facility-based design, the example of Santana Row that I showed you is a typical example for a local improvement that in the end is disconnected and produces an insular pedestrian environment that still requires an auto-oriented environment around it, because it is not based on thinking in terms of networks. Network-based planning, on the other hand, results in a sustained, and to me this is sort of another layer of sustainable, the sustainable streets moniker, that this is a sustained and comprehensive approach that leads to improvements for the pedestrian, bicyclist, and the transit environment. And I just want to quickly run you through an example of where we worked with a local community. This is sort of at a neighborhood scale, but it nicely allows you to follow along as to what the different steps are of making the most of the existing street network. So we, at the first workshop when we were working with this community, we asked everybody to indicate where they were driving, where they like to walk in their neighborhood, and which routes they take when they bicycle. And then we mapped the results of that exercise. And you can tell a little bit by the emphasis on the center that there were a lot of people participating from that area of the neighborhood, but you can readily imagine that you could blow this up to a bigger scale and have very good results with this kind of exercise to understand in which ways people use their streets. And so then we went through the step of analyzing the transportation network, and this is actually something that Jeff is going to get into in terms of the metrics of all of this during his presentation. But so we looked at the vehicular access to this neighborhood, which are the streets that are important for vehicular travel and will be so in the future. And then we looked at the bicycle priority routes, which ones should those be based on local destinations and so forth. And then we did the same for the pedestrian network. And then we overlaid all of those layers and created this multimodal framework, which then, as you overlay these networks, you realize which streets actually need to really include all three modes, which may only include two modes, and there are some streets where actually there's so few cars and pedestrians and bicyclists, there's no conflict, so they're the kind of the do-nothing streets. And so this then is the end result of that part of the network-based planning. And this is where I wanted to briefly detour just to assure you that you're already doing all the right things. San Mateo has obviously, as many of you know, already developed a bicycle master plan, so you have looked at your streets and you have asked people where they would like to bike and what the destinations are that they would like to bike to and the routes they use. And then you've done the same for the pedestrian. And you looked at which routes people like to travel on, which destinations they like to travel to on foot. And so these are the two network layers that you have already created for the city of San Mateo. So the second aspect of this is really then the balancing of land use and urban design and transportation. And this concept is called link and place. And this is, has been developed by Marshall, Jones, and Bujenko in their research. And what they're suggesting is basically that there is a balance between the transportation function of a street and the place function of a street, place being short for urban design and land use conditions. and that both in the planning of and in the design of the street should have an equal footing. And so if you look at this street with a high place status and a high link status, is something like the Champs-Élysées in Paris would be a good example. But you could also point to El Camino, I would propose, because it does obviously have a high transportation function, but there are all sorts of destinations that actually, ideally, you should be able to walk to. And so a point could be made that that is a street that also should enjoy a high place status, but clearly today does not. And then after you have devised your network and you understand what all the various desires are for what is supposed to happen on a given piece of the network, then you get into, well, how should we allocate the existing space that we have? Again, streets are already here. You're not building a lot of new streets. You're just working with the space that you already have. And again, the research done by Jones here in this case, from that same group of 3 that I mentioned before, suggests that there is this intricate play of trade-offs that occurs. On the left-hand side, you see where basically the desires for the link function and the desires for the place function on the outsides are within the triangle here of the available. This is the triangle. I hope you can see that. It's very subtle. This triangle here denotes the available space. And so since the desires for link and place are within the available space, the street can be built to the desires of both of those functions. But then there are other cases where you are already working with minimums. So you may be able, this is the second one, where you can only reach the minimums for link and the minimum for transportation function. And you're just barely within the available space. And then there are multiple variations on this, and you can get into, and this is what's shown in the third frame, that you can get into these heavy trade-off situations where the desires for both exceed the available space, but the minimums are still within, and then you just somehow have to figure out what kind of balance between the transportation and link function, the transportation and place function you want to strike. P is for the place function. Oh. And L is for the link function, link being for the transportation aspect of a street, and P for the place function. And so between these 2 lines, that's the suggested edge of the street. And I apologize. So the arrows denote, think of it as the taken width from the overall width of the street between the 2 boundaries on either side. You're allocating a certain amount to the link function in the center, and then in this case sort of 2 amounts to the place function on either side. And so you can run, like in this case here, you can run into a situation at the very end where the minimum that you've set for yourself for the link function, and think of it as number of lanes, and the minimum you set for yourself for the place function, think of it as the sidewalk with cafes. Okay, got it. All of a sudden you have these 2 bars, so the 3 bars here, they add up to more than the total width of street that you have. And that's where you get into these trade-off situations. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And so this is just an illustration of the kind of conversation that we then got into at this community that I mentioned before, where then, and I don't know how well you can see this back there. Is this all washed out at the top? Yeah. Okay. So essentially, this is just these red bits and pieces. They just denote changes to the existing street environment, where basically you're taking back space from what has been allocated to transportation, to the link function, and reallocate it to the place function of the street. And that is kind of by drawing these cross sections and showing plan views, we engaged with the community in finding where these trade-off points are that I mentioned. So the key network characteristics that we're looking for in a good transportation network that is sustainable are connectivity. So you want to have a lot of connectivity between neighborhoods, between neighborhood streets and larger streets where a lot of the destinations are, and you want to provide, because the connectivity really provides route choices. So there is not just one way of getting to the school, there are multiple ways of getting to the school, because the street network has a lot of intersections and it has to do with block lanes. We're looking for it to be multimodal, so accommodating multiple modes. And a lot has been said about this already, so we don't need to dwell on this. That's what the complete streets approach is all about. And it provides mode choice within the transportation network. And then this is very dear to me, that as an urban designer, that walking really needs to be the fundamental unit of the street network. So it means don't have long, long blocks where there's no cross street and there's no way for you to get away from a street if you are traveling along a segment of a street that is really noisy and whatnot. You should be able to have these route choices as suggested by the first principle, and all streets need to be walkable and they all need to be safe for walking. And then finally, it is important that the network include many different street types and not just, as transportation engineers often call it, arterial, collector, and local streets. There's really a very human desire about being presented with very different environments that entertain you and engage you and make you want to come back. And for that, you need many different street types, and that is something that we're doing as part of this project. So in closing, addressing network and street together is important to create a sustainable streets network. And this is an image from a project that we worked on El Camino for the city of Palo Alto many years ago, and it still has not happened yet, but I still like to use this example. With that, I'm handing it off to Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. So for all of the problems that Thomas talked about at the beginning of his presentation and all of these fabulous images that he's shown us at the end, the root of those problems and the solution to them is the nerdiest but most important aspect of transportation planning and traffic engineering, which is performance metrics. This is all top secret material. My industry does not want you to know about these things. I'm going to tell them to you though tonight. This is very special. So usually you're not allowed to hear this, but it comes with the price of admission for the program. So many of you have heard of level of service. And one of the reasons why we struggle so much in transportation, why there's this gap between what we want from our streets and what is delivered, is we have one way of measuring all of the things that we want streets to do, and that is level of service. Level of service is a letter grade system that measures either it tries to calculate the average expected speed on a street or the seconds of delay that a car experiences at an intersection. And if you're on an arterial and that arterial street is operating at greater than 30, 35 miles an hour, that's awesome, you get an A. Well done, traffic engineer. If your street, however, is operating at 13 miles an hour or less, that's level of service F. Similarly, if you have no delay, it's level of service A at an intersection. You add 15 seconds delay, you go to level of service B, and so on. And so for many of us, we have a tendency to confuse this letter grade system with, say, elementary school report cards, where it is seen that level of service A must be really, really good, and level of service F must be really, really bad. But that kind of depends a little bit on one's perspective, particularly if you consider what level of service is measuring. So a street with no cars on it, with no pedestrians, with boarded up storefronts and empty lots. That is going to be level of service A. But as soon as that street becomes successful with cars and shoppers and things going on, that's level of service F. And the worst thing that you could possibly do is to have a street that's so jammed full of people that, well, no one goes there anymore, right? Because clearly that would be level of service F and not something that we would ever want as transportation professionals. And so you can see that sometimes what we think is good and bad might vary depending upon your perspective. And if you're an economist as opposed to a traffic engineer, the street that is congested is the street where the transportation supply completely balances with the transportation demand. That street was sized exactly correctly. It was the right amount of investment so that at the peak of the peak, because another thing that's important to understand is that level of service only measures things typically at the peak 1 hour or even the peak 15 minutes. And so we size our transportation facilities and measure their results only for the seconds delay that cars experience at the peak of the peak. And so again, if you're an economist, you don't size your parking lot for the day before Christmas or the Thursday before or the Friday after Thanksgiving. You always size it for a typical condition rather than the peak of the peak. So again, what is important in transportation varies depending upon your perspective. There's also some other problems with level of service, including the way we typically calculate the expected volume of traffic. So in a level of service analysis, particularly an environmental impact report, we're required to be what's called conservative, and to assume that development built here in downtown San Mateo is going to generate just as much traffic as something in a more auto-dependent location east of 101. The data, however, is very clear that traffic generation varies more by location than it does by land use type. Here in downtown San Mateo, projects generate less than half of the vehicle trips than they would in a more auto-dependent location, even for people who are driving, in part because even if you're driving to downtown San Mateo, you can park once and do several different things because there's a mix of uses here. You can go to the library and listen to a presentation about level of service. Other key things about level of service are the ways in which we establish thresholds or triggers. So it's okay for a development project to cause a street to go from level of service A to level of service D. But the project that creates that trips a threshold that goes from level of service D to E may be required to mitigate all of the traffic problems that its neighbors created getting from level of service A to level of service D. So there's a lot of sort of mathematical problems and other situations that make level of service challenging from a land use and economic development perspective. But the biggest problem with level of service is what happens when we exceed a threshold. So say I have a development project and I run my traffic analysis and it says the adjacent intersection is going to go from level of service D to level of service E, and I'm required to mitigate my negative impact on traffic. I have relatively few options. I can reduce the size of the project or move that development demand someplace else. I could move the project entirely to a more isolated greenfield location where there isn't current traffic congestion, because again, it's only the threshold that matters. It's okay for me to take traffic from level service A to D. I could theoretically reduce my vehicle trip generation rate through transportation demand management, but most EIRs are suspicious of whether those demand management programs will actually be continued or be successful, so best to discount that. The most likely scenario is that I'm going to be asked to widen the adjacent roadway. Now that seems like it's a smart idea. So if I widen the roadway or add some turn lanes, that's going to make it easier for motorists and reduce the congestion at that intersection. The problem is that by making it easier for motorists, I'm also making it more difficult for bicyclists, for pedestrians, or for transit. Now that the roadway is twice as wide, it's harder to get across the street, and traffic is moving faster, so it may be more dangerous for pedestrians and more less comfortable for cyclists. If I've had to narrow the sidewalk in order to widen the road. I've made it less pleasant for pedestrians and therefore made it more difficult for transit to be successful. So the problem with a focus just on intersection level of service as a tool for managing traffic congestion is that oftentimes the solution is creating the problem more than whatever it was that you thought was creating the problem to begin with. That level of service and over-reliance upon it becomes a self-fulfilling congestion prophecy. And part of the reason it is a self-fulfilling prophecy is because of the nature of what we call induced demand. None of us loves traffic congestion. It's horrible sitting in traffic congestion, particularly if you're in a hurry or trying to do it every day just to get to work. And so we complain about it. We complain about it to our elected officials and to our traffic engineers, and they respond by widening the roadway, which makes it faster to drive. This is great. Except now, there are so many trips that I wouldn't have made before, like the awesome new restaurant that serves sliders in downtown San Mateo. Now I could go there that I wouldn't go to it before because the roadway is wider and it's faster to drive. Or I could move to cheaper housing that's farther away and still be able to drive to work. So the result of faster driving is that more people drive, which then results in more congestion, which makes us unhappy, which makes us demand to widen the roadway, which results in faster driving. And we wonder why, despite the fact that every time we go out and vote for a transportation sales tax, that we're promised that adding just one more lane will finally solve that traffic congestion problem, and yet, strangely, it has never happened. And it hasn't happened because the transportation system is a complex, dynamic system that influences human behavior and real estate values. So what do? I think the most important thing to do is to change the way we measure transportation success. Transportation performance metrics are used throughout transportation decision-making, not only when we're measuring impacts in an environmental impact report for new development, but also as engineers are managing individual traffic signals, or coming up with funding programs, or submitting reports to the County Congestion Management Agency, or imposing impact fees. They're pervasive throughout our transportation system. And in order to get them right, we've got to ask ourselves, what do we want the transportation system to do? Transportation is not an end in itself. Mobility alone accomplishes nothing. Mobility is a means for communities to achieve other important goals. And it's important that our transportation system and its performance metrics reflect those larger goals. Transportation, I would argue, is largely about economic development. The biggest impact for a transportation investment is changing land values. Extending roadways out to undeveloped land increases the value of that land and allows them to be developed. Investing in transit in the core of our communities allows increased density to work. Investing in walking and biking facilities increases quality of life, the attractiveness of a place to live or to locate your business. We need to be really focused and acknowledge that this is really the primary reason we make transportation investments. But we also make transportation investments for social equity reasons, to make sure that all of our citizens have access to the benefits of life here in the city, that we have that all citizens have access to jobs and to education, and to the ability to get services, and that the benefits of transportation investments accrue equitably across our diverse society. It's also very important for quality of life and for ecological sustainability, particularly considering that transportation is the biggest source of carbon dioxide emissions in our economy, and also one of the greatest users of energy, more than all buildings in the city. So lots of cities have been thinking about what to do about performance metrics and to get smarter about transportation. One example that we've been inspired by and that the city of San Mateo has been looking at is Santa Monica, which went through a long process to clearly identify their local values. Lots and lots of citizen participation, clear about what they wanted the transportation system to do across all variety of kinds of activities. They recognized that it was critical that if there was a goal that citizens wanted the transportation system to achieve, that we had to come up with a quantitative performance metric to determine the degree to which that goal was met, that we needed to create the shortest possible list of metrics that relied largely on existing or readily achievable data, or otherwise those metrics wouldn't be used. And that we needed some additional data collection and new tools to be developed in order to be able to assess each of those metrics. That it was important that the baseline conditions for each of those metrics be measured, and that there was a commitment to reporting back to the city council and to citizens once a year about how the city was doing in its transportation investments in order to meet the larger goals. So Santa Monica started with a long list of principles, including equity and safety, public space and enjoyment, ecological sustainability, created a short list of potential measures, and including many that did double duty across multiple categories, like vehicle miles traveled is a useful metric for both assessing congestion as well as air quality and CO2 emissions. Then the city created a really, really big chart that looked at each of the metrics, how the data was to be gathered in terms of measuring that metric, and what were the situations under which that metric would be used, such as prioritizing funding or conducting an environmental impact report. This then allowed them to look at each of their individual streets in order to achieve their larger goals. As Thomas already mentioned, walking is the fundamental element of the transportation system. Every mode of transportation is dependent upon a quality pedestrian environment, that all streets need to be good for walking. Santa Monica also recognized that there's a land use component to the walking, which is basically a lot about making sure that the needs of daily life are within walking distance. And so Santa Monica's walkable retail districts were basically the fundamental element of its transportation strategy, was its land use base. And so they wanted to make sure that all citizens were within a 10-minute walk of the needs of daily life, and that the portions of the city that weren't within a 10-minute walk of the needs of daily life, they specifically created new walkable retail districts to make sure that everyone could at least walk to get a quart of milk or to get to an elementary school. Similarly, they wanted to make sure that all residents were within 2 blocks of a high-quality bike route that would get them to downtown within 10 minutes, and that 90% of residents were within a 10-minute walk of transit that ran at least every 10 minutes all day long. This then allowed them to create a street typology map that looked at every single street in the city and asked the question, what is the place function of this street? And how important is this street for every mode of transportation? Recognizing that there are a limited number of kind of street types, including what you see in the dark blue lines, which are transit boulevards. These are the El Caminos of Santa Monica that need to function as important auto streets, but where the highest importance of the street is moving people by bus. So those are the transit boulevards. There's a series of neighborhood commercial streets that are in brown, and on these streets, the most important function of that street is supporting neighborhood commercial. That retail sales per square foot is the primary transportation performance metric for those areas. Congestion doesn't matter. All that is desired is to make sure that those retail districts thrive, and that means providing a very high quality pedestrian environment and measuring and managing parking exceedingly well. Other streets were residential streets where quality of life, tree canopy, landscape characteristics, and low traffic speeds were the primary metrics. And other streets were industrial streets where ensuring that adequate truck access was provided was the primary goal and the most important performance metric. What's important is that for each of these streets, there is a target for each mode of transportation, so that the city traffic engineer can go out and measure how well the street performs at a quantitative basis for each mode of transportation, and then see how that measurement meets the target. This then allows the city traffic engineers, in an objective, quantitative way, to understand the degree to which one mode of transportation can be inconvenienced in order to benefit another. The goal being to bring each mode into balance with the other. Not that, we're gonna make it impossible to drive on one street in order to make it totally awesome for pedestrians, or make it horrible to walk on a street in order to make it great for bikes, but to strike the right balance for each street typology. But they also knew that what was really important were people happy? And so doing regular public perception surveys was a really important component of their transportation performance metric system. The result of all of these changes was that Santa Monica was able to make a commitment to a very significant amount of development, but making sure that as the development occurred, that there was no net increase in motor vehicle trips citywide by creating a significant amount of mode shift and reducing what would have been a significant expansion of the congestion zones of the city into basically containing congestion in Santa Monica around the freeway on and off ramps, protecting most of the neighborhoods from traffic intrusion. All of this gets folded into an overall city report card that incorporates not just transportation, but how well the city is doing on meeting its affordable housing goals, its air quality, its arts and culture, and human dignity goals as well. And as I mentioned, the result of all of this is not only was the city able to get approval of its general plan, but succeeded in not only meeting but exceeding its AB 32 goals for reducing CO2 emissions, the first city in California to do so, and to meet its own very aggressive sustainable city target for energy and CO2 reduction. So in summary, what we find with transportation performance metrics is that the most important thing is to focus on outcomes and to make sure that those outcomes reflect all of your local values. And that's exactly what these forums are here about in San Mateo and why we're really happy to be working here. To make sure that you use the shortest list of performance metrics that capture all of your values, and that those metrics rely upon readily available data, because if you're significantly increasing your data collection costs, the metrics simply will not be used. Rather than focusing on issues like crowding or congestion, that we focus on quality and economic performance. And our recommendation in the case of Santa Monica, but also in many cities, is that while it's important to continue to focus on congestion, that's not something that any of us wants, that a far better metric would be per capita vehicle miles traveled or per capita auto trips generated, or per household. Something that we'll be thinking through with the city as we move forward on this project. And if you want more information, I have a whole book, a whole chapter in my book on performance metrics. It's available at Amazon. And with that, I think we're ready for questions.